Hi, how are you doing? Thank you for joining me today. My wife and I recently watched the old miniseries Lonesome Dove, which is based on Larry McMurtry's Pulitzer Prize winning novel about the Old West. It was one of my favorite pieces of literature, so I was excited to finally get a chance to read or watch the movie version. As we were watching that show, it reminded us of the hardships of living 150 years ago. And it reminded me about just how grateful I am that we have so many modern comforts. In Lonesome Dove, they take months to travel from Texas, where I live. They live further south in Texas than I do, but still in Texas. And they traveled all the way to Montana, and several of them die along the way. And a couple of years ago, my family and I actually loaded up the minivan and we made it to Montana in just a few days, stopping all along the way. We got there and back safely. And, I have friends who routinely travel all over the world and trips that would have taken years to accomplish in the past, and they do it again in a few days. Beyond travel, I'm able to record on a computer, and I'm using a computer to record this video. I'm in an air conditioned house, and as I said, I live in Texas. It's now late June, so I'm very grateful that I do have air conditioning. And again, I'm able to post this video on YouTube, and once I do, it's going to be accessible to people all over the world. I've had people on the other side of the world who've actually commented on my videos. And all this is available and possible because of advancements in science. And thanks to science, we routinely do things that in our day and age are normal. And when I was a child, it would just seem like magic. So I appreciate science, and it really seems like there's nothing science can't accomplish today. And things like it's completely, nothing seems beyond science graphs. However, there are in fact limitations to science that should be recognized, and that's important for today's topic because this is me continuing my series on reconciling Christian faith with science. In my last video, I focused on the false assumptions made by many Christians that the Bible speaks inerrantly about the physical world. I explained that in inspiring the Bible, God clearly reveals spiritual truth, but he does so keeping with the understanding of the natural physical world as it was understood at the time when the Bible was written. Therefore, we're not going to find scientific accuracy in the Bible. We shouldn't expect it to be scientifically accurate. And I conceded that modern science will have a better understanding of the natural world than you're going to discover in the pages of the Bible. And clearing up this assumption goes a long way in healing the rift between Christian faith and science. However, this reconciliation also requires a consensus from both sides. And today I want to discuss a common assumption from the scientifically minded people that must also be addressed for science and scientific understanding and Christian faith to live harmoniously and coexist together. The assumption I want to talk about today is that scientific methodology can potentially explain all reality, so all truth must be scientifically verified. Now let's look at that assumption. Now, I want to start off by saying it's not my intention in this video to call into question any scientific discovery or to challenge any scientific consensus. While I know more about science than some people, I recognize that I am far from being an expert in science. So I'm not the one to examine and critique studies that are in peer-reviewed science journals. Other people on YouTube are going to be better at that than me. Today I'm going to be debating a perspective that views the natural sciences as the primary or even exclusive means to discovering truth. According to this perspective, any truth is scientifically verifiable. Therefore, anything not scientifically verifiable is perceived as fantasy. The problem isn't this problem isn't a scientific discovery or methodology, but a belief about science. a belief system called naturalism, or more specifically, scientific naturalism. Naturalism is a philosophical belief that everything arises from natural properties and causes. Therefore, supernatural or spiritual explanations are excluded or discounted. This is a philosophical perspective that creates a schism between science and Christian faith because it doesn't allow for the possibility of God or any other spiritual entity existing. Now, many scientists operate in a way that takes this philosophical perspective for granted. As such, scientists are much more likely to be an atheist than the population as a whole. According to a 2009 Pew Research study, 95% of Americans believe in God, while only 33% of scientists believe in God. Now, another 18% of scientists would acknowledge some type of universal spirit or higher power, but not necessarily God. So if you do the math, this amounts to roughly half of scientists not believing in God. It also would mean that half do. But roughly half science operates under this naturalistic belief system. And that half that believes in scientific naturalism seems by and large to be setting the rules for scientific discovery. And this perspective spills over into the general population. There are people who affirm scientific naturalism while having very minimal scientific education themselves. You can go to a college campus and you'll find students who fully embrace scientific naturalism, and though they may have only taken 1 or 2 bachelor's level science courses. And I've encountered scientific naturalists who didn't go to college, and their only formal scientific education came from high school courses taught by the basketball coach. So having this perspective isn't contingent on one's degree of scientific understanding. And while I said that this doesn't, not all scientists, fall into this category of being scientific naturalists, some of the most prominent and high-profile scientists in recent decades have been outspoken atheists or agnostics who advocate this naturalistic worldview. For example, we have Stephen Hawking, Carl Sagan, and Neil deGrasse Tyson, who all have been key in popularizing scientific beliefs and specifically this naturalistic scientific worldview. And so as a belief system, scientific naturalism isn't science. It's a philosophical perspective that leans on science as its supreme, if not sole means of discovering truth. So when we really get down to it, this video is a philosophical discussion rather than a science one, and I feel a whole lot more confident speaking on matters of philosophy than science. So let's talk about the problems with this philosophical belief in scientific naturalism. I once read an article in which someone who held the scientific naturalist perspective said something to the effect that once you look at science and realize just how much we know, the need to believe in God goes away. And that assumption really underlines much of the naturalistic understanding of the world. While naturalism has roots that go all the way back to ancient Greek philosophers, it really had a resurgence in the wake of scientific discoveries in our modern age, as we discovered more about the natural laws that gave us natural explanations for phenomena that had previously been attributed to God and other spiritual forces. The conclusion was made that everything must therefore have some kind of natural explanation. The belief in the divine was therefore considered a superstitious understanding of the world by people who didn't really understand how the world works. Now that we have this scientific understanding, we don't need these supposed superstitious explanations any longer, or so they thought. And when I read this article with this, person saying, well, when you just really understand how much we know, you don't need to believe in God anymore. My initial response when I heard that was that this author didn't really appreciate how little we do know. It's really easy to become overconfident in your knowledge. I really accumulated a great deal of theological knowledge through my personal study while I was still in high school. And I went to Bible college really expecting to wow my professors and just how much I knew. But I quickly learned that I didn't know nearly as much as I thought I did. And by the time I graduated college and went on to seminary, I realized I still had a lot to learn, but I was really confident that I was going to eventually discover all of the answers. I'd have all the theological mysteries figured out by the time I finished my education. By the time I got to my Master's of Divinity, I resigned myself to the reality that I'd never have all the answers. And then I enrolled in a PhD program, and in my first semester, I discovered that I didn't even have half the questions. So what's the point? Believing that you have it all figured out is evidence of your ignorance rather than your comprehensive knowledge. The most important thing for us to know is just how little we do know. While we have amassed a great deal of scientific knowledge, particularly in the last 100 years, there are still countless scientific mysteries. While I'm not a scientist myself, I'm confident that there are scientific realities to the universe that the most brilliant scientists haven't even begun to investigate or even thought to investigate yet. The reality is, we don't even know how much there is to know. And scientists do recognize that there are mysteries yet to discover, true scientists. And the scientific naturalists, however, have a confident assertion that science can discover the answer to these mysteries, and only science is capable of discovering the answers to these mysteries. And according to this philosophical perspective, you can only know what is verifiable scientifically. Nothing can possibly exist beyond what is scientifically verifiable. This perspective logically fails, however, because you can't scientifically verify that all reality is scientifically verifiable. Beyond the circular reasoning of this philosophical perspective's central claim, let's consider how improbable it is that all reality is comprehensible in this manner. Now, scientific investigations are by nature examinations of the physical universe. In other words, all that is comprised of matter. The material world is, all observed directly or indirectly through our five senses. So now let's consider the presumption that it is, and how presumptuous it is for us to assume that if we can't see, hear, taste, smell, or feel it, that it must not exist. Imagine if sight weren't a thing. For the sake of this argument, we're going to just assume a strictly naturalistic evolutionary understanding. And imagine that simple organisms never developed eye spots, which were the primitive cells that were able to detect light, and those eye spots later developed and evolved into eyes, and most animal species, including humans, do now in fact have eyes. But let's assume that particular evolution never occurred, and humans or any other creatures just don't have eyes in any form or fashion. Now, the eye is the means which we use to detect light, which then we process in our brains to create an image that we think of as vision. But if we didn't have eyes, we would have no concept of light. Imagine how our scientific understanding would be limited if we were ignorant of the existence of light. Light would still be real. It would still have a tremendous effect on the physical universe, but we know nothing about it. And consider, light is a key component in photosynthesis and in the process of plants growing. Light is at the heart of so many of the laws of physics. So even if we manage with our other senses to effectively develop a robust scientific understanding, we'd have a major gap in our understanding of the universe because we were still ignorant of this thing called light. We would still likely have a physical explanation for how plants grow, the motion of the universe and all these other matters, but we'd be ignorant of this key component that's a factor in that. Now let's consider the possibility that there's a component at play that is just as real as light, has just as big of an impact on the universe and how the universe works, but we do not have a physical sense organ to apprehend it. Our calculations and formulas that we use today in science might not be accounting for something that is just as big of a component as light is. Now, if the theistic understanding of God is real, that would very much be the case. Now, most people in the modern world, and I'd even argue a large percentage of Christians, really have a deistic or mostly deistic understanding of God. Now, what I mean by that is deism is a clockmaker understanding of God. God created the world and then leaves it alone to run on the laws of nature, and he is primarily an observer. Now, as I said, many Christians really, while claiming to be theists, are really more deist. They really still see God as primarily observing the universe and watching, but they will acknowledge that he occasionally tinkers with or interferes with the operations of the universe. So he's not restricted or prohibited from getting involved, but he just doesn't do that very often. So they view God primarily as a passive observer still. But theism, true theism, sees God actively at work in the operation of creation. God isn't only creator, he is also the sustainer. Now, most modern people think that our understanding of science has eliminated the possibility of such a God existing. The existence of natural laws, however, doesn't negate the possibility of God actively directing the universe. Perhaps the laws of nature are the means, the tools by which God controls the universe. God may be the one powering and directing those very natural laws. To illustrate, consider a small child watching a puppet show. Now, the child, being very young, sees the marionette dancing around on the stage and believes that it's a living, animate being. His mother then explains that there's actually an unseen puppet master backstage controlling the marionettes. And then the child assumes that this puppet master is using some kind of voodoo magic that goes beyond our understanding, but he's just magically making the puppets move. And the child goes on believing that for some time until he goes back to the show when he's a little bit older. And when he's older, his perception is a little bit keener, and he notices the strings pulling on the marionette. And he realizes that this movement of those strings is actually what causes the puppets to move. He then concludes that since strings are responsible for the movement of the marionettes, there must not be an unseen puppet master at all. Now, you see the problem with that assumption. Naturalists are no different. The scientific discovery of natural laws is really significant. It's just as significant as that child noticing the puppet strings. It gives us a better understanding of how the world works, but you don't fully comprehend what's going on with those natural laws until you realize that someone is pulling those strings. God is at work in the natural laws. Therefore, the discovery of natural laws doesn't discount the existence of a theistic God. The discovery offers us a greater insight by the means which God operates. Now, I grant that the conclusion I just made merely suggests an alternate explanation of the facts. That explanation assumes that God is existing, and the naturalists will demand evidence proving God exists. In response, I'm going to say something that might surprise you, especially if you know that have heard me in my previous videos and you know my belief and my firm confidence in God. But I'm going to say something in terms of when naturalists demand proof that God exists. There is no proof for the existence of God. That is the reality. Now, I can already hear many of my Christian viewers immediately reciting the classical arguments for the existence of God. I'm aware of them. I know them well. I've studied them, and I've studied them close enough that I recognize their shortcomings. The most common argument is the cosmological argument, which is that that when you look at the world, something must have created it. It must have come from somewhere. Now, scientists debate whether or not the universe had a beginning and whether there was a Big Bang. And, it's my understanding that most scientists still favor the view that the universe did begin with a Big Bang. And so let's just assume then that Big Bang is correct. The question remains, what caused the Big Bang? God is a logically plausible explanation, and it is the explanation that I personally believe. But if we're intellectually honest, we can't prove that to be the case. Scientists are exploring various potential explanations for the Big Bang that don't involve God. They stretch my level of scientific comprehension, so I can barely understand what they're talking about when they explain them. I definitely don't feel like I could explain them to you, but I don't think it's necessary for the sake of this argument. I'm just acknowledging that there are other potential, possible explanations, including that the world is eternally existent. And when you look at where does the cosmological argument get us? We say, oh well, the something must have started the Big Bang. There must have been some cause to the universe. But does that mean God? The cosmological argument can be traced back to the philosopher Aristotle, who argued that the world originated with an unmoved mover. And when Christians hear Aristotle talk about the unmoved mover, they immediately say, oh, that's God. And Aristotle's arguing for the existence of God. But Aristotle did not believe in God. He was not a theist. He did not believe in a God in the way we would. And this unmoved mover is really more of an impersonal force that was a first cause in setting things into motion. However, Aristotle himself believed that the universe was eternally existing. And so when you really look at the logic of the cosmological argument, it doesn't bring us to knowledge of God in the way that a theist would understand him. Now, another more common argument that Christians and theists like to point to for the existence of God is the argument from design. This argument looks at the order of the physical universe, and the conclusion is made that there must be some kind of intelligence providing that order. Now, I believe this argument has a lot of merit, but it does fall shy of leading us to, again, a theistic understanding of God. Based on the argument alone, without appealing to Christian faith or the Bible, and just looking at what the evidence of intelligent design leads us, we can't conclude that the order in the universe is the product of a single intelligence. You could argue, based on the evidence, the physical evidence, there are actually multiple intelligences at work designing the universe. Maybe there was these different gods formed a committee to discuss how things work and how things are going to be. Now, if you've ever been a part of a committee, you know that there's arguments and debates and differences of opinions, and compromises have to be made. And sometimes things, situation isn't as good as you would have liked it to be because of the compromises made. There's an old joke that a camel is a horse put together by a committee. Maybe the reason our world has so many problems in it is that we live in a world constructed by a committee of gods. Now, that's not my personal perspective, but logically it could be true. When we look at the problems in the world and how flawed it is, we could also explain those potentially as this designer to the universe being powerful and intelligent, obviously, but not fully omniscient, not omnipotent. And so the world we have is just the best he could do. Now, so while I admit that there appears to be signs of intelligence designing the universe, Christians are really making a big logical leap when they take the evidence and say, there seems to be some kind of intelligence putting the universe together and organizing the universe. And then if you go from that to, oh, God is real, that is a big logical leap. And the evidence doesn't really support that, if we're going to be intellectually honest. So yes, these arguments don't prove the existence of God. They fall short in that. They should, however, at least upset someone's confidence in a naturalistic understanding of the world. They, at the very least, suggest that there is a logical, evidential reason to suspect that something might exist beyond the physical universe. Now, in a debate on whether or not science is capable of answering everything, Oxford chemistry professor and outspoken atheist Peter Atkins was asked what evidence would convince him that God was real. And he said that there was no evidence that he could ever convince him that God is real. God is not real, and there is no God. And so any evidence that would suggest he is real is therefore invalid evidence. He even goes far as to say that if he were to personally have witnessed the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, he would assume that it was a hallucination rather than concluding that God was real. Now, his central premise is that truth has to be based on evidence, and you should believe whatever the evidence presents. But he didn't believe in God because there isn't evidence, and it goes, and that's why he doesn't believe in God. He says there's no evidence, but he destroys that central claim and his central premise by his admission that he would reject any evidence that contradicts his atheistic faith. And I intentionally use the word faith here because what his confession indicates is that his atheism is an article of belief that he would insist on believing regardless of any evidence to the contrary. This is a philosophical perspective called fideism, which is the philosophical belief that knowledge is rooted solely in faith, not evidence and reason. And you just believe what you want to believe, and evidence and reason go out the window. And his atheism is clearly a statement of faith, not reason and evidence. Atkinson's position is rationally no different than a really hardcore Christian fundamentalist who insists that the Bible says 6,000 years ago God created a flat earth and he did it in 6 days. Therefore, any evidence contradicting that is just complete nonsense, and I refuse to even consider it. And nothing you can do will convince me that God didn't create the world in 6 days 6,000 years ago. Now, most would consider that sort of fundamentalism anti-intellectual. But to be consistent, we must regard Atkinson's position as equally anti-intellectual. Now, Atkins might have PhDs. He might be a professor at one of the most prestigious universities in the world. His position on God is entirely anti-intellectual nonetheless. Now, as a Christian, I hold faith in very high regard, but I also believe that we should integrate faith with reason. And I mentioned Atkins as an example to demonstrate that scientific naturalism is a belief system. It's not science itself. Atheists, specifically atheists of a naturalist variety, because I know that there are multiple types of atheism, and it's not fair to, assume that every atheist is a scientific naturalist, even though a lot of them are. But these atheists will often assert that atheism isn't a faith, it's the lack of faith. However, whenever you make a declaration along the lines of there is no God, you are making a faith statement. While there is no proof that God exists, which I conceded earlier, there also is no proof that he doesn't. And it's logically impossible to disprove, or to prove a negative. It's impossible to prove that there is no God. The laws of logic and reason won't allow that. Therefore, atheists and theists both hold to a belief about God's existence, and they do so without proof. They're both operating on faith. The theist has faith that there is a God. The atheist has faith that there isn't one. A more intellectually honest position would be agnosticism, which claims that they don't know if God exists. And earlier I mentioned Carl Sagan, who was a very influential spokesman for science in the decades past. He's no longer with us in this world. And he personally rejected the label of being an atheist because he had to admit that he couldn't prove God didn't exist. He would, acknowledge he was an agnostic. He did, however, still demand scientific empirical evidence for all knowledge, and he would hold to the philosophy of scientific naturalism, but he was at least, intellectually honest enough to say, I can't know that there is no God. But he still was looking for, refused to acknowledge the existence of God until he had that physical evidence. I point this out to say that scientific naturalism is a philosophical belief system, and it dictates how its inheritors conduct scientific inquiry. This belief system demands physical evidence to validate any belief and claims it's irrational to believe anything without physical evidence. The problem with this is that God himself, assuming that, if we assume that God is real, which is the claim that I would hold and any other Christian or theist would also hold, but we're talking about God himself being non-physical. He is not a physical being. And therefore there would not be any physical evidence for God. He is spiritual. He is a spirit. He is immaterial. And therefore he can't be seen, heard, smelled, felt, or tasted. Now, the Bible does claim that at times God has taken physical form that would be perceptible to the senses, but in his essence, in his natural state, he is imperceptible to us physically. And so God, unless God chooses to take physical form to show himself to us, we cannot see him, hear him, or any other way perceive him by the senses. And as a being separate and apart from the physical universe, God is therefore beyond the scope of scientific discovery. We have the Hubble Space Telescope, and it's shown us things that we had never expected to find. But it won't see God, nor would any other telescope that's more powerful that we might develop in the future. No matter how strong the telescope, you're not going to see God in it. And we've also built these large particle colliders, which are big rings, and they shoot particles, atoms, at each other, and they travel miles at incredibly insane speeds, and they smash together, and then as the atoms break apart, the scientists have instruments that are able to measure the particles falling apart, and it's able for us to understand, scientists to understand the elements that comprise matter, even beyond the atomic level. These particle colliders are never going to come up with God. And no other scientific methodology is going to come up with direct evidence for God. Science is limited to the exploration of the physical world. Therefore, we shouldn't expect it to discover spiritual realities. And to refuse to believe in God because we can't detect Him with our physical senses is like the equivalent of saying, I don't believe in sound because I can't see, smell, or taste it. You were trying to perceive something in a way that particular thing can't be perceived. So we're never going to have direct evidence for God. Now, science does at times verify things that aren't directly perceptible to the senses, but can be observed indirectly by their effects. Now, are there any effects of God perceptible to us? Well, as a theist, I could go back to the cosmological argument and point to the existence of the universe and saying, look, this is evidence of the effects of God's work. Where we and everything else is just evidence of the effects of God. But, as I acknowledged earlier, there are other potential explanations for the world. But that brings us to another shortcoming of science. Science relies on inductive reasoning. Now, to give you a short logic lesson, there are two primary means of reasoning. There are others, but the two primary are deductive and inductive reasoning. Now, deductive reasoning draws a conclusion from premises. And if we accept the premises of a valid deductive argument, then you are logically compelled to accept the conclusion. Now, to give you a very simple example, all airplanes have two wings. That's the first premise. The Boeing 737 is an airplane. Therefore, the Boeing 737 has two wings. If we accept that all planes have two wings, the first premise, and that the Boeing 737 is an airplane, you cannot logically deny that the conclusion that the Boeing 737 has two wings. Even if you've never seen a Boeing 737, you have to acknowledge that that's the case. Now, to challenge that conclusion, that you have to falsify one of the premises. Like, for example, if you demonstrated that not all airplanes do have two wings, then you could draw that conclusion into a question. But if you accept the premises as true, the conclusion has to be true. The thing is, deductive reasoning leads to a certain conclusion. But science does not use much deductive reasoning. It uses mostly inductive reasoning. Now, inductive reasoning gathers data and comes up with the most probable explanation of that data. The scientific method that you learned in middle school is an exercise in inductive reasoning. And the problem with inductive reasoning is that it gives you the most probable explanation, not a definite, final, certain explanation. It's the most likely explanation. Regardless of how much data you have, there is hypothetically an infinite number of explanations for that data. That's also why in a court case, in a criminal case, it uses it relies on inductive reasoning, and so the standard is to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. That's an acknowledgement that you can't prove anything beyond any doubt. It would be logically impossible, and you could never get a conviction. But since science, brings us to that sense of most probable explanation for the data, that means logically science is a lot less certain than some want to admit. Scientific consensus has and does shift with new discoveries. For example, Newtonian physics replaced the Aristotelian physics that had governed science for centuries. And now today, quantum physics is questioning Newtonian physics. Now, logically, you can say that beyond just what we directly observe, there is no such thing as scientific fact. You know, let's take something, and whenever you say that, I know you brings people to a shock, and the thing people most often go to is gravity, and we generally take gravity as fact. So let's look at even gravity and show the weakness of science, logical weakness in science. Scientists have observed a consistent pattern in how objects with mass relate to one another and postulated that a force called gravity draws objects with mass towards each other. This is a very solid explanation which has served us well, and I would agree that its probability of being accurate is ridiculously high. I'm not saying that gravity is not real. I'm going to be clear about that. I'm just acknowledging that there is a small potential for another explanation. Who knows, 1,000 years from now, scientists could possibly develop a better explanation for this movement of material objects in relation to each other that actually works better than gravity, and they look back at us and laugh that we were primitive enough to believe in this force called gravity. I'm not saying that could happen, but I'm just saying it could potentially happen. And there are, in fact, oddities about gravity that scientists struggle to explain. For example, it is the weakest force in nature, and yet it has an infinite range. And then there's also the issue of what causes gravity to begin with. For decades, physicists have speculated that particles called gravitons create the force of gravity. However, there was no direct evidence that gravitons were real. Now, it's my understanding that in the last few years they have observed particles that are believed to be gravitons. But scientists were rather certain that they existed before they observed them. They postulated that they must exist because without them, how do you explain gravity? In essence, scientists were claiming that while we can't prove gravitons exist, we're confident that they are there because we can't explain certain natural phenomenon unless they do. What's the difference logically between that and claiming while we can't prove God exists, we're confident that he does because we can't explain how the world originated unless he does? And this shows the flaw in inductive reasoning in which scientists relies. Now, one can come up with countless explanations on the available data, and one must then decide which one is the most probable explanation. And the decision as to which is the most probable is largely dependent on one's philosophical perspective. In other words, our beliefs inevitably bias our interpretation of the data. Because the natural scientists have been governed by a philosophy of naturalism for decades now, the possibility of spiritual forces being involved has not been considered a valid explanation of data for some time. Now, I also recognize, when you talk about science, that because we can't scientifically verify these spiritual forces are real, science can't declare definitively that the best explanation for a problem that they can't explain is that God did it. But I would say that science shouldn't impose a philosophical bias into their evaluation to the point that they discount the possibility that God did it when you don't have another valid explanation that you can prove. So from a rational perspective, we can't say with certainty that God caused the Big Bang, but we should acknowledge that it is a valid possibility. And this is a much more intellectually honest way of evaluating data and a much more honest way of conducting science. Now, in conclusion, I'm aware in this video I still haven't given any evidence that God exists. In fact, I straight up said that there isn't any proof and can't be any proof that he does. That wasn't my purpose in this video, to try to prove God exists. My purpose was to demonstrate that scientific naturalism is a philosophical belief system, and it is just as much a matter of faith as Christianity is. God's existence can never be scientifically proven, but that isn't because God isn't real. It's because scientific inquiry is limited. There are certain questions that science doesn't have the means to answer. If we cling to a philosophical perspective that insists that all knowledge must be scientifically validated, then we will remain ignorant of many truths. And the questions that you can't answer through science might be the most important questions to have answers to. Answers as to where did we come from, and not only where, but why are we here? What is our purpose? And a true scientific naturalist will have to admit that there is no purpose, which is a sad conclusion. The philosophy of science, scientific naturalism, will bias your view on the world. And it will, keep you from having allowing for the possibility of a supernatural explanation, and for anything. And any supernatural explanation, any spiritual explanation will seem preposterous nonsense to you. And when this philosophy governs science, science becomes hostile to Christian faith. Just as Christians need to let go of their theological bias that put their interpretation of Scripture in conflict with science, scientifically minded people should question their philosophical biases that prevent them from considering the possibility that God is real and active in the world. Casting these biases aside will allow Christian faith and scientific inquiry to harmoniously coexist in your mind. Science has made so many wonderful things in our world, but Christian faith can offer meaning and richness to life in ways that are beyond the scope of science. And while science has explained a lot, it can't answer why we are here. It can't explain our purpose. As a Christian, I would say that purpose is found in a relationship with Jesus Christ. And if you are a scientifically minded person, please don't let a philosophical assumption stand between you and finding purpose in your relationship with Him. I know that might be hard for some of my viewers who are, if you're watching this video and you are scientifically minded, because there are so many Christians who subscribe to an anti-intellectual brand of Christianity that your own personal scientific understanding considers preposterous. But you don't have to hold those primitive views to be a Christian. I know that because I'm not that kind of Christian.